Before we begin, let's talk about computer programs. For a gross oversimplification, at their core, pretty much all computer programs take in some form of input, perform some operation on it, and produce some form of output. But sometimes, this input can, intentionally or not, be outside the bounds of what the program is prepared for, and this can lead to a variety of issues for the program. These are bugs, and programmers do not like them. They'll try to the best of their ability to produce a program without any bugs, but even the best programmers are unable to come up with every possible edge case that their 40 gigabyte enterprise level software could ever encounter its entire lifetime. That's why software development is a continuous process, and it's why programmers are always looking for better ways to find bugs before their users do. That's where fuzzers come in. Fuzzers are, in short, programs specifically designed to identify edge cases and bugs in a target program. Most fuzzers accomplish this by generating large amounts of input or test cases and sending them to the target and analyzing how the target reacts to the input. But there are many different approaches fuzzers can take during their input generation process. Blind fuzzers are by far the most simple kind of fuzzer. They generate a random input and send it to the target program, disregarding the nature of the target program entirely. This has the benefit of being very simple to implement, but the obvious drawback of being extremely unlikely to come up with a meaningful test case for the target program. To give the fuzzer a fighting chance, a seed corpus is sometimes implemented. The seed corpus serves as a bank of valid input files for the fuzzer to slightly change to generate new input in a process called mutation. Additionally, the fuzzer could also have a built-in set of rules that describes how to generate random input, and this set of rules is called a grammar. To allow the fuzzer to come up with meaningful test cases, the mutation-based approach relies on a very large seed corpus being used, and the generation-based approach relies on an extremely comprehensive grammar. So there's obviously improvements to be made to the blind fuzzing approach. A slightly more complex and very popular kind of fuzzer is the coverage-guided fuzzer. These kinds of fuzzers use some method of tracking which parts of the target program are executed or covered by their test cases. The general idea is input is randomly generated until a new part of the target program is reached, and then that input is mutated to generate more random input. This process is definitely an improvement over blind fuzzing, as it's able to reach deeper and deeper parts of the target program if given enough time. However, sometimes reaching those new parts of the program to increase coverage requires a mutation so large or so specific that the fuzzer won't reasonably generate it. A more complex analysis of the target program itself would be needed to overcome this limitation. Hybrid fuzzers attempt to bridge this gap. They combine the aforementioned fuzzing techniques with more complex processes like symbolic execution, concolic execution, or taint tracking. How each of these work doesn't matter too much, but they essentially help the fuzzer generate inputs that'll only travel down one specific path within the target program's execution. This helps the fuzzer overcome the really specific mutations that involve a quote-unquote magic byte. But it doesn't really let the fuzzer explore the target more broadly. Another approach to fuzzing that was briefly touched on before is coverage-guided grammar fuzzing. This combines the coverage-guided approach of searching for new parts of the target program to explore with an extremely detailed and specific grammar for the fuzzer to model its input off of. Consider a browser-like software that's expecting a well-formed HTML file as its input. Save for the infinite monkey theorem, no amount of randomly generated bytes will come close to this requirement, so a fuzzer attacking this target will likely only hit bugs super early into execution. This is where a grammar comes into play. A grammar would describe to the fuzzer how to generate its input so it meets the extremely specific input requirements the target has. This would allow the fuzzer to make large-scale mutations that a coverage-guided fuzzer couldn't come up with on its own. The problem with these coverage-guided grammar fuzzers is the grammar provided to the fuzzers must be human-made, and it must be comprehensive if the fuzzer is meant to uncover every bug. Even with near-perfect knowledge of the target program, a human generating a grammar exactly like this is unfeasible. To alleviate this problem, grammar inferring programs have been developed. While these programs are not themselves fuzzers, they analyze a given target program and generate a grammar that a grammar fuzzer could potentially use. Most accomplish this via an oracle in the form of a modified version of the target program that just checks whether or not an input is valid. These programs generally take a while to generate their output grammar, and they do require a human to develop and provide an oracle. Additionally, the outputted grammars are often incomplete and not viable for fuzzing, and the whole process of grammar inferring being a pre-processing step can also be a turnoff. So, the upshot of all of this is that while there are a lot of different valid approaches to fuzzing, they all have a variety of pitfalls unique to them. Some need the help of a human to get going, some require access to the underlying source code of the target, some require complex machine-specific techniques, some need a good seed corpus to kick off the fuzzing process, some require an extensive grammar to generate inputs, and some can only work if the target follows a specific parsing method, and some can only make small-scale mutations to their input files. Here's a table of a variety of well-established and often used fuzzers. All of them have one or more of these limitations, preventing them from being used universally. Except for GRIMOIRE, that is. GRIMOIRE is a fuzzer with a novel fuzzing approach developed by Tim Blazitko, Cornelius Ascherman, Moritz Schlurgel, Ali Abbasi, Sergei Shumilo, Simon Werner, and Thorsten Holz. Definition-wise, a grimoire is a magical book that contains various types of spells. Specifically, it contains specific magic symbols that, depending on their order, will produce new spells that can be used later on. Amazingly, this is actually a decent description of how the grimoire fuzzer works under the hood. GRIMOIRE is a coverage-guided grammar fuzzer that has grammar inference built in to the fuzzing algorithm as opposed to having it as a pre-processing step. This means it has all the benefits of a coverage-guided grammar fuzzer, like the ability to fuzz a target that requires highly structured input, and like the ability to make large-scale mutations, but without the drawback of requiring a comprehensive grammar to be provided to it by a human. It can fuzz a target program with a complex input specification completely out of the box. So how does GRIMOIRE accomplish this? It starts out decently similar to any other coverage-guided fuzzer, where it generates an input and waits until a new part of the target program is reached. Then it enters what's called the input generalization step. Suppose for the first time, byte X is reached in the target program by GRIMOIRE. The specific test case that reached X is then split up into chunks of equal length, and those chunks are then systematically replaced by a quote-unquote gap symbol. A gap, in this case, is pretty much just a placeholder. It's not meant to contribute to the actual input. The input is then reformed as a combination of chunks of the original input and gaps replacing the original input, preserving the original order as well. This new input is then ran back through the target program to see if X is still reached. If X is still reached, then the part of the input that was replaced by a gap can be inferred to be not necessary for a test case to reach X. This is repeated for all chunks of the input until it's determined exactly which parts of the input are necessary to reach X, and which parts can be replaced by gaps. Finally, if gaps end up next to each other in this reformatted input, they are then combined together to form a larger gap, and a new generalized input is formed. Each gapless chunk of this input can be thought of one of GRIMOIRE's quote-unquote magic symbols. After generalizing enough input, GRIMOIRE now has a dictionary of generalized input composed of magic symbols, or slices of generalized inputs. Additionally, GRIMOIRE is also able to read in tokens and strings directly from the data section of the target's binary that might prove useful later. In other words, GRIMOIRE is now able to pull from a set of generalized inputs and a set of tokens. GRIMOIRE can now produce mutations with these two sets in its arsenal. GRIMOIRE mutations are categorized into input extension, recursive replacement, and string replacement steps. Starting with the input extension phase, GRIMOIRE first generalizes an input to mutate. Then, it does a series of coin flips to grab a random generalized input, a random slice of a generalized input, or a random string or token from the two aforementioned sets. Once this piece of data is obtained, it is simply appended to either the beginning or the end of the initial generalized input to form a new input, and this concatenated input is then stripped of all of its gaps and sent to the target for testing. Moving on to the recursive replacement phase, GRIMOIRE takes its initial generalized input and appends a gap to its beginning and end. Then, similar to the input extension phase, another random generalized input, slice of a generalized input, string, or token is pulled out of GRIMOIRE's dictionary. Then, a random gap from the initial generalized input is replaced with this random selection, with its beginning and end also being appended by a gap. Now GRIMOIRE has a new input formed of two fragments combined together, scattered with gaps throughout. This process is repeated a random number of times until a long combination of generalized inputs, slices, strings, and tokens is formed, where it is then finally sent to the target for testing. Finally, for the string replacement mutations, GRIMOIRE recognizes the impact that keywords could have when a program expects highly structured input, as replacing one keyword with another could drastically change how the target reads the input. First, GRIMOIRE takes an input and scans it for strings that also show up in its own dictionary of strings pulled from the target binary. It then chooses one of these and then finds another occurrence of this randomly selected string in the input. Once it has found the second occurrence, it replaces it with another random string from the dictionary and sends the full input to the target for testing. It then replaces all occurrences of the initial random selection with the same randomly grabbed string from the dictionary, and then this input is sent to the target as well. All three of these steps are done in sequence hundreds of times over to generate more and more complex inputs for the target program. This allows GRIMOIRE to learn about the grammar the target is expecting while it is also fuzzing the target. Isn't that crazy? After finalizing this procedure, GRIMOIRE's developers put their approach to practice. They piggybacked off of the source code of another popular fuzzer, Red Queen. Red Queen is initially a coverage-guided fuzzer, and the patches to it that implement the GRIMOIRE algorithms took up about 500 lines of code, so not too much overall. But does it actually work? Yes. Yes, it does. Extremely well, actually. To figure out how effective GRIMOIRE is, 3 experiments were carried out by the GRIMOIRE team. First, GRIMOIRE and a variety of other popular state-of-the-art fuzzers were tested on the same set of target applications. Next, GRIMOIRE was tested in conjunction with existing grammar fuzzers to see if they could work better together than separately. Finally, GRIMOIRE was actually used to find some new bugs in existing real-world programs, including some that you've probably heard of. The researchers working on GRIMOIRE had 6 questions they wanted to answer. First, how does GRIMOIRE compare to the other state-of-the-art bug-finding tools? Second, is their approach useful even when proper grammars are available? Third, how does their approach improve the performance on targets that require highly structured inputs? Fourth, how does their approach perform compared to other grammar inference techniques for the purpose of fuzzing? Fifth, how do their mutators impact fuzzing performance? And finally, can GRIMOIRE identify new bugs in real-world applications? Try to answer these questions as I walk through the results. In the first experiment, GRIMOIRE was pitted against AFL and Red Queen, both coverage-guided fuzzers, and QSIM and Angora, both hybrid fuzzers. Red Queen was watched especially closely as GRIMOIRE should theoretically be a direct improvement on Red Queen's design, since the latter's source code was the starting point for the former. These fuzzers were all thrown at the same set of targets, including 4 scripting languages, four scripting language interpreters that are Ruby, mRuby, PHP, Lua, and JavaScript core, a compiler, TCC, an assembler, NASM, and an SMT solver, boolector. They were all ran on the same Ubuntu server with the same processor and the same amount of RAM for 12 48-hour trials each, so everything is completely fair. Grimoire's team then plotted all these trials into these graphs, which show the hours passed on the x-axis and the amount of basic blocks of code in the target the fuzzer was able to reach on the y-axis. In most cases, Grimoire does better than all of the other fuzzers it was tested against in terms of raw code coverage, and in many cases, it did much better. The only real outlier was the case of Lua, and this was because Lua can handle both text files and bytecode. Angora can fuzz with bytecode inputs pretty efficiently, while Grimoire is stuck as a language-based fuzzer, so Angora had a bit of an edge for Lua specifically. Next, the research team wanted to test Grimoire against popular grammar-based fuzzers. Nautilus was picked as it is famously state-of-the-art, and it has existing grammars for mRuby, PHP, Lua, and JavaScript core. The trials for this experiment were ran pretty similarly to the ones from the first experiment, and these graphs were produced as a result. Somewhat to be expected, Nautilus had a pretty clear edge due to the fact that it was starting with a grammar that Nautilus's developers had spent a significant amount of time manually fine-tuning. But in spite of even that, Grimoire still managed to pull ahead of Nautilus while fuzzing mRuby. To see how well Grimoire and Nautilus could work together instead of against each other independently, Grimoire's team then pulled out the seed corpus Nautilus had formed after its first 24 out of 48 hours fuzzing. The team then let Grimoire fuzz for another 24 hours based off of this seed corpus instead of needing to infer the grammar for itself. These quote-unquote incremental trials produced these graphs as a result. In all of these trials, the Grimoire and Nautilus combo was able to outperform Nautilus running alone for the same amount of time. Next, the researchers working on Grimoire wanted to see how their techniques matched up against an existing grammar inferring fuzzer. Glade was picked for this experiment because it is once again described as state-of-the-art. Glade works in two steps. It first uses a seed corpus of valid inputs to learn about the grammar, and then it uses that inferred grammar to fuzz the target program. As stated previously, grammar inference is usually a pre-processing step, so Grimoire is kind of at a disadvantage because it infers grammar on the fly. To make things a little more fair, Grimoire was given the same seed corpus that Glade had initially. Regardless of Glade's advantage, Grimoire was still able to vastly outperform Glade when fuzzing mRuby, Lua, and libxml. The graphs show a horizontal black line that describes how much code the provided seed course already covered. It also shows Glade's performance both including and excluding the time it spent training its own inferred grammar, but neither case could hold a candle to Grimoire's performance. Throughout all of these experiments, the authors of this paper also kept track of how long it took for each of Grimoire's structured mutation techniques to generate inputs, as well as how many of those inputs led to new paths of execution in the target being found. This was compared against Red Queen's input-to-state mutations that served a similar function. Neither technique had a clear advantage over the other according to this table, but the plus side is that Grimoire's new prototype of a technique is already on par with the existing mutation techniques in terms of new inputs found over time spent mutating, which is pretty cool on its own. Now, while it's all fine and dandy to just compare code coverage between all of these fuzzers, which, to be fair, is a really important statistic to consider, let's not forget the whole reason fuzzing exists at all. The point of all of this is to find bugs. Throughout these experiments, the Grimoire team was also manually logging and keeping track of any bugs that were found by the fuzzers across any of the target programs. And look at this. Grimoire found a whopping 17 bugs across PHP, TCC, boolector, and NASM. Red Queen, AFL, QSIM, Angora, and Nautilus found 12 bugs combined between them. PHP and NASM had both been out and widely used for almost a quarter of a century as of this paper's publication, and Grimoire was still able to find not just one, but multiple bugs with both of them. And I'm going off script a little bit here, but I think that is just the coolest thing ever. But that's all the data that was produced by Grimoire's experiments. Were you able to answer all the research questions? So, to sum up, Grimoire is a novel yet extremely powerful approach to fuzzing. It is the first fully automatic fuzzer that makes large-scale structural mutations to the input while fuzzing, as opposed to having to infer a grammar in a pre-processing step. It can comfortably fuzz binary-only targets, open source targets, closed source targets, etc., without the need of a seed pool or expert knowledge of the target program, or even an already laid out grammar for a jumpstart. Despite all of its constraints to make it easy and flexible to use, Grimoire still outperforms most state-of-the-art fuzzers in most common fuzzing scenarios. Even when a fuzzer like Nautilus can outperform it with its expertly crafted grammar, Grimoire can still offer meaningful results in the fuzzing process if it rides off the work that Nautilus has already done. There's still some complex syntax that would be beyond the scope of what Grimoire could infer on its own. Take this example of some HTML code. Grimoire could generalize this input and figure out that the space between these two tags can be reduced to a gap. But we as programmers know that any two valid symbols could replace the tags as well, so long as they are the same symbol. The generalization process itself isn't perfect either, but the Grimoire team has already come up with some ideas to make it better. Regardless of its pitfalls, though, Grimoire is still an incredibly impressive tool to make fuzzing highly structured input easier.